Welcome back to another episode of Adventures in Machine Learning. I'm one of your hosts, Michael Burke, and I do data engineering and machine learning at Databricks. And I'm joined by my co-host,
Ben Wilson. I update landing page websites for MLflow at Databricks.
Today we are joined by Kirk. He started his career at Microsoft as a software development manager. And then after Microsoft took a variety of technical leadership roles. Currently, he's CTO and founder at Graphlit, and their primary product is an API that automates the ingestion, extraction, and enrichment of unstructured data from any data source. So, Kirk, when you moved to Kespri, am I saying that correctly?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
A company focused on drone-based aerial intelligence, you specialized in perception ML. How was that transition from traditional software into perception ML?
Well, what we really saw was, it's a lot about the data, as you guys obviously know. How do you get the data into the hands of the computer vision algorithms? And that's what we were focused on a lot. And so we ended up kind of leaning heavily on the ingestion side, the preparation side, and then letting our ML engineers kind of invent the computer vision algorithm. So I think for us, a lot of it was just having really clean data, and then innovating a bit on the computer vision side.
Got it. Was latency a factor?
We were essentially offline. So they would, like the insurance companies would fly a drone, they would upload to the portal. And so we were able to do it kind of in the background, but turnaround time was still a factor in that.
Got it. So when I think drones, I recently watched a YouTube video by Mark Rober, if you guys are familiar. And it's basically all the different ways that you can demolish a drone. And I think it was basically a big commercial for a drone company, but the best drone demolishing solution is actually another drone called the Anvil that is a really fast, really powerful drone that just smashes into other drones. And they can be deployed around bridges or like nuclear power plants, whatever it might be, to protect. Did you guys ever work on security for drones, or was it more just, are the drones seeing the right thing and acting in the correct way?
Well, it's interesting. So the company had started as a hardware company building their own drones before I started there, and then they were doing a transition to a pure software platform, and so more of a data analytics, data cataloging tool that I was working on the last year before COVID, and then they ended up getting sold off and integrating into another product. But yeah, so it was really more about the data, and then just kind of the perceiving of the real world, cataloging it, search and retrieval.
Got it. And then there, how did you think about building a successful software team? Because you've built a bunch of them.
Yeah.
Was there anything different because it was more in the hardware space? Because when you started at Microsoft and then went over to GM and then Kespri, I'm sure there's different challenges based on the end product. So did you notice any of those challenges change how you create teams?
No, that's a really good question because it's something we looked at of kind of, there's like the Spotify approach, with guilds and that kind of model. And there's different teams of like, is it a full stack team? Do you separate out a design systems team? We ended up, because it was moving into pure software, we really had to think about the UI side. So it was a more UI heavy product than maybe their original stuff had been. And then the other side of it was actually code reuse and thinking about, could we refactor out like UI design systems between their two products? And so that was definitely something we had to think about in terms of staffing. But then also the back end of that product was a brand new infrastructure. And so I think learning scalability and cloud, honestly, just the CI/CD and infrastructure deployments like Terraform, um, that skill set wasn't necessarily something we hired for, but we had to train for it in some ways. So it was a multi-layered product where you really had to think about all of that. And especially just once you get up to scale, this isn't just a demo anymore. Like, how do you actually make this thing scale under a lot of data load? And so we basically had a small team kind of incubating that, and then that ended up kind of growing out.
Got it. Yeah, that's actually a topic that comes up a lot on the podcast, which is these demos and blog posts, let's say, and that's not super representative of what you see in large organizations.
Right.
So getting into that, how did you make stuff scale? And what does that mean to you?
That company actually, we kind of ended up, it was an interesting situation. Just so we kind of got to the point and then COVID hit and it kind of changed the business a bit. But so we never got to a point of scaling that product there. But at my current company, that's really what we focused on from day one is getting something that, I mean, under load will automatically scale out, be able to handle, I mean, millions of files or pieces of content. And a thing I'm a fan of is like an event-driven system that's, I mean, you have a queue that you put everything into, it kind of feeds out into multiple servers or serverless architecture, and that can actually burst out capacity. Because we end up getting a lot of bursty consumption. I mean, as people are kind of loading data in, and then maybe it's just consumption for the next hour. And so we want to be able to balance those two things. So it's I think it's important to think about if you're going to have to get there, and you might want to bite the bullet a bit and kind of think about that kind of event-driven kind of even I mean serverless or non-serverless, but at least just a queued architecture.
I've got a sort of a meta question for you.
Yeah.
And this came up in a previous podcast as well, as we were talking to another innovative founder. Um, do you think you would have been able to build what you've built, hire the people that you've been able to hire, and move as quickly as you have been able to if you were trying to do this within the confines of an extremely large tech organization that's sort of focused on
Yeah.
enterprise support?
That's a great question. I would say no. I mean, I've been doing, I mean, probably 75% of the last 20 years have been startups or small, like, and 25% at bigger companies, and 100%. I mean, you could totally move faster at a small company. I think there's a level of sort of dynamic nature of okay, you have to adjust on the fly. I mean, maybe it's not pivots per se, but it's I mean, month to month, you may make some pretty quick turns and left and right as the market dynamics change. I think which is really hard to do as you're thinking about, I mean, the team management and promotions and all the I mean all the other dynamics. Like Microsoft was, I mean, I love my time at Microsoft, but it was very political. I mean, it was very like you really had to think about your career there and if you wanted to move up and all that kind of stuff. And at startups, there's sort of a half-life that's a lot shorter. And I mean, you're not, for better or for worse, you're not thinking about that. You're just like trying to get product out the door. And I mean, and so it's I enjoy the 0 to 1 a hell of a lot more than the bigger company now, but it definitely changes the dynamic of how you of what you can build. And you see a lot of companies slow down after acquisition. I mean, I just talked to a friend who their company got bought by a big fintech company, and he's like, "Yeah, it's like boring now," and it's not. I mean, you hear that all the time. So
Is there an inflection point? You know, as somebody who's definitely probably the final approval on hiring technical
yeah,
staff, is there an inflection point in the life of a startup that's focusing on something cutting edge like yours is, where you say, I need to start hiring a different sort of person at a certain
yeah.
point? And what would that inflection point be for listeners to who are curious about this? Like, what does the CTO think about or CEO think about when we need to shift the hiring dynamic?
Yeah, I think there's a level of just kind of fleshing out. Like it's easy to scale one front end dev to three front end devs. I mean, if they're all on the same stack or they're all kind of using that, I think but you do start to hit a point where, I mean, it's like the Amazon like two pizza teams. Like there, I think it's around that 5 to 7 kind of per functional area that becomes more difficult because then you have to maybe think about having a lead. I mean, the CTO can't sort of manage them directly. And whenever you have to start adding an extra layer in there, or I mean, or maybe it's an area that the founding team doesn't have experience with. Like, I mean, I think that's another area that's harder because you have to find somebody that can be that kind of chief that you can trust to. I mean, because every startup founder is a micromanager. I mean, you have to be. I mean, to
Yep.
do it right, but there's a point when okay, how do you hand that off? And I think that's when things become tricky as you grow.
How do you personally create the cutoff for you should hire versus you should learn it?
Um, it's a good question. I definitely have seen there's some things that are just more like okay, I'll hire somebody on a project basis. Like I know we have 3 months of work, we'll just hire somebody, plug somebody in, and accelerate. I think there's areas that works really nicely. I mean, like a good one is like CI/CD. Like I built our CI/CD pipeline, and it's going to be the heart of what you do in the future. So like as a technical manager or whatever, CTO, whatever you want to say, is you have to know it. Like you have to be able to do that, because I think my reasoning is you're going to have to be the fallback. Like if other people have issues, who are they going to ask? And so I tend to, I mean, always start learning it and maybe prototype the first one and then hand it off, because they have to have a backstop of to support the team in the future. And so, I mean, I ended up doing that with our Terraform at a previous company where I just kind of built out the first Terraform scripts and did that. And it's not something, I mean, I wouldn't call myself a DevOps engineer, but at least I understand it soup to nuts of how it all works. And if somebody, and then I could hire somebody and be like, oh, hey, here's, I mean, take this over, and at least be able to answer any questions about it. So.
So it sounds like project duration and then project importance are the two axes where you would define when to hire and when to learn.
Yeah, I think, I mean, project duration for sure. I think what would be a good term for that? I mean, there's some things that are just threaded through the life of the project, and so it's more like foundational things, I might say, like the DevOps side of it. And I think that's an area of learning that's important. I think there's other areas like, I mean, I don't consider myself a data scientist or an ML engineer. I'm more of just a platform guy. That, I mean, I can build scalable things and you plug in different APIs, and I'm happy to like hand that the true ML innovation off to people that really know that better. And I think that's the kind of stuff that I wouldn't necessarily try and learn. It's I know there's people smarter than me out there, and so I think that's another axis there of like, can other people just do a much better job out of the box, and it's easier to just find really smart people to do that.
Got it. So market supply and demand in there as well.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, there can be times when cost is a factor. I know when we were at Caspery, we were looking to hire ML engineers, and the salaries were just insane. Like, I mean, 200K, like starting for like somebody with like 3 years experience back at the time was, I mean, and we were just seeing that was market. And it was just like we couldn't afford it. I mean, of hiring at some of those times. And sometimes that's when you just be like, okay, I got to take the next 2 weeks to figure this out myself, because the market is just like so expensive right now for people.
Got it.
Yeah, that
Okay.
reminds me of things that I had something I was working on last week that is sort of related to this. We in Databricks engineering have a habit of trying to just make something work, figure it out, time box it, of course.
Mhm.
And we were looking back through some old Confluence docs that we had because we're just cleaning stuff up. And I found the version 1 of our CI/CD
Mhm.
deployment for an internal project, and I'm looking through it. I'm like, yeah, this definitely works, and it's robust. It I tested it out in a staging environment. I'm like, yeah, it still works. This is cool. Except it took me an hour and a half to copy paste all of the shell commands that would trigger all of these different services to do everything associated with the deployment. And then comparing it to what we have now, which is entirely UI based. You click,
Mhm.
you validate, there's links. It automates tons of stuff for you. When errors happen, they're bubbled up in a way that's very understandable, clear, and giving you a path for resolving them in a way that you
Yeah.
don't have to go in and like do a log dump and figure out what's going on. That system that is now on like version 4, we hired for that. We
Yeah.
hired, a number of people. Well, first hired one person, and now it's a team of 14 or something. And they build all of this stuff. They're all
Mhm.
experts in that. They couldn't come and do what we do, but we can't do what they can do.
Right.
It's just
Right.
because you look at the tech lead on that team, and like they have 25 years experience, and they hired a bunch of people with all 10, 15 years experience in doing this stuff and automating these systems. And you just look at the volume of what is running through these systems. You're like, hang on, there's 100,000 builds a day that
Yeah.
are going out. This is insane, and it just works.
That's awesome. I mean, and that's that scaling thing of, I mean, there's almost like this pain threshold. Like you're asking kind of what are the axes? I mean, at some point, when it becomes something that you're having to think about every day, the pain is really growing of, I mean, part is just the importance to the company like that. I mean, if there's some things that just have to work. And so, I mean, that may be something that, yeah, you're going to have one pair of eyes dedicated to that for life. I mean, as you grow. And I think but yeah, like you can always get by kind of doing things in a lightweight way, but then once they become kind of such a focus, I mean, you got to have some automation around that and scaling and to be able to scale that out. So yeah, I mean we try and leverage tooling. Like we use Azure DevOps for, I mean, of our builds and things like that. And I mean, I'm a big fan of managed services where I assume there's a team at Microsoft that's smarter than I am that can do a lot, like do these things a lot better. And so I'm happy to like just let them manage that rather than trying to build our own pipeline and I mean things like that. But there's other places that I know we can do a lot better. And so trying to balance that is the important thing.
Yeah, the buy versus build debate is really interesting to think about because it's I mean it's not that complex of a decision, but there's so many moving parts and so much
Yeah.
uncertainty around what the alternatives can provide. So yeah, you're just working with very nebulous and like unrobust data. So
Yeah.
it's
I
interesting
think
to
it's
think about.
I think it's where you just have to kind of check yourself on a regular basis and be willing to change. And I think that's bigger, like your original point, Ben, of like what is harder about being in a bigger company. I think it's that slow moving ship. And like in a startup, you could be like, okay, we made a mistake. Like we screwed this up. Let's go do X instead of Y. And you can just make a big change. And so like we had something with our authentication stack in our UI that we were struggling with, and it's like you have to make a decision. Like, are we going to stick with this, or are we going to flip it to like a different vendor? Or at some point, I mean, you have to make those hard choices and evaluate those things, and maybe spend the weekend like just redoing something because that's just the right thing for the long term. So.
For contract-based tools, do you usually reevaluate when the contract is up, or do you try to break mid-contract if something goes wrong? How do you think about that?
That's interesting. Most of our longer term contracts are more productivity tools. So I mean, it's like Figma and Lucid Chart and stuff like that. We don't have a lot of, trying to think, from a technical standpoint, it's mostly usage based things rather than so it's just more API type stuff. Um, so I don't have a good answer for that just from our like in our engineering stack. I mean, we use linear, we use stuff like that, but we haven't actually made a change off those yet.
Got it. Okay, cool. So one of the topics that I wanted to focus on, and shifting gears a bit, is as we alluded to earlier, you've spent a lot of time, you said around 75% of your time working in smaller organizations.
Mhm.
And with that comes the concept of 0 to 1 development, where you're starting in a greenfield space. You need to innovate and iterate, and then hopefully have something that solves a business problem. So, how is that fundamentally different from just incrementally improving an existing piece of tech?
Yeah, I mean, I think it I mean you're developing the vision at the same time you're developing the code, and I think that can be some of the harder part of, I mean, it's I sort of have this analogy I was just using, like one of the LLMs this week, and if you ask it a question, get a response, and then ask a follow-up question, it gives a much, like you can ask it to refine it and it gives a much better answer. And that's kind of like 0 to 1 development where after you've been going for a year or so, you're just refining like the actual software you have in there. You have a baseline of code, you have a baseline of like experience with the customer, and iteration can you have a lot more data to make decisions on. In 0 to 1, it's a lot harder because you really just like you barely have talked to customers probably. You are really just kind of going on a gut feel and a vision that you have based on whatever market dynamics that you believe is the right way, but also you have to show people something. And so I mean, especially for us, like I mean, an API first platform, it's like, how do you show somebody an API and be like, hey, do you want to use this? And so you have to then build something, demos and things like that. Um, so it just becomes more of it's not even an engineering task, it's a product task and a more of a holistic task, I should say, from 0 to 1, which I think I enjoy. I mean, it's not just coding, it's, I mean, developing the market, figuring out the direction, trying to get feedback quickly. And so it ends up mixing together all those dynamics rather than just, hey, go build a feature and like focus on that side.
Ben, how much 0 to 1 development do you do these days?
We're weird uh, with what we do. So we can get away with quite a bit of that. So in a given calendar year, we're probably 60% greenfield,
Mhm.
um, which is not typical of a tech company like Databricks. Um, and that just speaks to the culture at the company, the
Mhm.
culture of the founders. Like they very consciously hired a bunch of like a big mix of people who have a particular attitude. Like it's not the move fast, break things. It's the move that fast and build 80% good enough and then refine
Mhm.
that later on with
Yeah.
40% of your time. But you really don't want to hire a bunch of people that want to do the 100%. Like, hey, I'm building a refined product. And there are companies and industries where you need to do that. It's very important. Like as you alluded to, financial services. I think that's
Mhm.
what taking a startup into that ecosystem. Those people get bored because now you have to ship something that just
Mhm.
works. It cannot be like it's kind of good enough. Um, People just won't use it if
Mhm.
they see all those edge cases not working. So with what we do, we get to that 80% on that green field, and we have a huge customer base, so we can get feedback quickly.
Mhm.
And if it sucks, it's either can we fix this and make it useful? Like, do people care? Then go and do that. And sometimes that is inventing new things in order to plug into that. But it's also the hey, we got this done really quick or in preview. Nobody's using it. Nobody cares.
Mhm.
On to the next thing. Don't
Yep.
don't delete the code yet. Eventually delete the code, but you know, it allows you to pivot very quickly. And I think it's very challenging for engineering leadership to maintain that culture.
Mhm.
And this is the only place I've ever been that they do that. It's
And it's interesting because, I mean, given the background, I mean, I mean, the academic culture a lot of times is for perfection of like, I mean, continuing to research something and it's actually great. I mean, that you got to ship someday and getting feedback is the most important part. And I learned that like super early in my career when I started Microsoft. My first project was this thing called Blackbird, which was essentially like pre-web because I'm that old that it was like right before the internet kind of launch, and this was their internet publishing platform for like magazines on the internet, basically pre-HTML, I should say, and they killed it after the second beta. And so I had worked on there for like I think about the first year or two I was there, and they got feedback and they realized, look, the market's changing. Like HTML publishing is now the thing, not this kind of private thing, like more like what AOL was doing back in the day. And to learn that a big company like that, you just invested like all this team and people and all this and marketing, and to be like, okay, go on to the next thing. And it's a hard choice to make. But I learned, I was like, okay, well, wow, like this is what you can actually do this. Like, and then but a lot of the technology we built got disseminated into other products.
right.
And so it was really an innovative product, but yeah, it's I mean, it's a hard choice to make, but you got to get that feedback.
Ben, do you kill projects?
I think you would be surprised, even though you work at the same company that I do, how many things are ideated on, a prototype is built, and then we just are like, yeah, move on. Get some candid feedback from people. We like just tell them, give us brutal, honest truth. Like, does this suck? And sometimes people are like, yeah, I'm not using that, or I have no need to use that, and then pivot.
Mhm.
Interesting. Yeah, I can't recall a single thing that has been killed that's been released. So I do field engineering. So I am working on customer implementations, and Ben is an actual software engineer that does Databricks engineering internally. But yeah, I can't think of something that got killed.
You wouldn't have heard about it. So
That yeah,
yeah,
okay.
if something gets into definitely general availability, like a GA release.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's not going away. So that's why you're very careful about
Mhm.
what gets to that point. And I'm curious to hear from your perspective, Kirk, about how you think about that in a fast moving startup.
Yeah.
Where do you guys have that concept, or do you embrace that concept that an enterprise tech company would do, like you did at Microsoft? I'm sure where there's a private preview and then there's a public
Mhm.
preview and then you ship GA. Do you guys do that? And what is your process
It's
for saying like, all right, we don't want to maintain this. Nobody cares.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a lot of it ends up being around the API surface area for us, and there are some things that we end up deprecating. There are some things like I took a stab at of like architecting one piece of it, of like this is the way that I don't know part of the RAG pipeline works or something like that, and maybe we end up refactoring that away and saying, look, I don't really like that approach. Um, Here's a new kind of cleaner version, but we kind of have to do it in the sense of keeping. I mean, we can't just rip things out of the API and I mean, if people have code running, or even if I mean, even if they just reference it in the schema, it could break them. And so so that's some of those areas. Um, so yeah, it definitely comes up. I mean, there's some things that I've had to do of like I don't know, maybe I have one field for something and then I expand that into an object in the API. You have to really like maintain that and know
Yep.
that we can future proof for that. And so I end up sometimes being a little over opinion, or I don't know, maybe over specific, where it's like, okay, if I'm going to add something, I'm going to add a place where I can add more things to it, and sort of think ahead and be like, oh, I'm not just going to make that a Boolean, I'll make it an enum, because I mean, I can expand later. And so I think I definitely think about that, of kind of future proofing a bit to make it more easily expandable and less breakable from a surface area standpoint. But a lot of what we do is just kind of hidden behind the scenes. Like there's just workflows running, and it's the API surface area that we have to focus on. The That's what the customers touch.
Got it. Yeah, and you've been seeing that, Michael, as you've been digging in more and more into ML flow source code. That surface area, everything's very structured and well documented. Well, somewhat well documented, but everything's locked in.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you've heard us on meetings and stuff that you've been a part of, where somebody's like, "Oh, can I add this argument?" And we're like, "No, no, no, no. We're not adding any more arguments here. We don't need that. We can use this other methodology for doing this." But then you start going down to the turtles that lie beneath, and you start realizing like, wait, the back end has all of this private implementation that a user of this tool never sees, and we can
Mhm.
change that willy nilly as much as we want because they're dev APIs, and that's the real challenge I think in designing API first services, is making sure that you have that contract that is
Mhm.
sort of sacrosanct. It can evolve over time, but you have to think about like all those breaking changes, and deprecations are scary. How do you notify users like, hey, this is
Mhm.
going away in 6 months? You know, do you need service support in order to help migrate off of this? And what you said, Kirk, it really speaks to me on a personal level with that whole like, hey, we have to think about how we can make this extendable in the future.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the hardest parts of software engineering. I think a lot of people who are looking at it from the outside are just like, well, yeah, it's hard to write code. And then you ask a software engineer and they're like, no, code's easy. It's hard to
Mhm.
design code so that it's
Yeah.
that this thing will last 15 years.
Well, and I mean, the previous company startup I had for 10 years, and I mean, I developed some patterns that I'm actually kind of reusing some of those same patterns today, of like how do workflows structured for this? I mean, are they kind of sequential? Are they like a DAG? And I mean, a lot of the patterns I developed of just what worked over time, you end up just reusing them in your career and at other things. And so a lot of it is just, hey, okay, I mean, this is the way we did video for broadcast, and we had this kind of sequential pipeline that the data got flowed through, and you configure knobs at each step. And a lot of that, I mean, our Justin pipeline is very similar to that today, but it's just indexing, data prep, I mean, and data enrichment and those kind of things. And we kind of do the fan out behind the scenes. So we're not exposing the DAG kind of thing to the customer. They just say, hey, here's the different things I want as an instruction set. More like, I don't know, more like a configuration as code kind of model, and then we just kind of do the work they need on the back end. So.
Can you list a couple of the things that you have learned over the many years of software development that might be hard to learn so our listeners can have the shortcut?
Oh, let me think. I mean, I'm kind of old school in that. I mean, I started as an object-oriented guy, like C++, and kind of I'm so much of my career and how I go about development is colored by that. And so I think it's interesting today with, I mean, more functional programming and I mean, just how coding is so different. I mean, in a lot of ways today, um, and just obviously, I mean, also the front end development is different. So let me just think for a sec. I mean, I think one of the missing things that I see is software architecture. And you're kind of saying this a little bit. Is like, I mean, thinking about what you're going to do, coming up with a consistent architecture, coming up with patterns, and having somebody that kind of thinks about that before writing the code. And I think that role has kind of been diminished. And like even I've been at places where they're like, that's like a bad word. Like nobody even wants to think about architecture. And I always kind of think that I think it's a lost art in a way where I think people could really, I mean, if you had somebody, I mean, and it could be somebody that's like a technical product owner or a technical PM in that role, but somebody to kind of think at a high level, how does this stuff fit together? How's it going to work a year from now in the future? Kind of rough data model, like, well, what are the entities? Like, what are the objects we're dealing with here? Like, if you look at like the Stripe API or something, like there's typical entities they're dealing with, and they probably can plan out like, okay, here's how these things are going to go together. And I think someone needs to own that, and whatever you call that role, um, I think just sometimes people get in the weeds a bit too much with the coding and just like they're not seeing the big picture as much. And I think we used to look at that maybe probably too much back in the old days, but um, I think it's the biggest learning. I think that could make a little bit of a comeback that people could kind of like almost start with like whiteboard based development of just let me try and draw it out first and then dig into the details.
I mean, Michael could talk to how it's done at Databricks because he's working, or he just went through his first process of that,
Oh yeah.
which like we're a relatively young company when you look at the average age of people that are doing stuff, but it feels like if you look at people's output, it feels like everybody's in their 50s
Oh well.
because it's enforced from on high about you have to do a design doc. And that
Yeah.
design doc has to cover stuff like this. And you have to think through it. And then you submit it for review to your tech lead and they tear it apart. They ask all of these questions like, this isn't consistent with this other API. how how does this feel to a user? We talk about user experience all the time. What is the customer
Mm,
user journey with using this API? Is this too complex? Is this, very simple but not powerful enough? And what are those trade-offs? And also there's questions about just simply like, hey, this kind of does this other thing in a similar way to this other API,
mm,
but the signature is different and
right.
it
Right.
behaves differently. Let's not do that. Let's conform these so that it just feels natural. And the goal, I think, like my underlying goal, if I was to say like, here's my number one thing with the design doc and any API that's built, the thing that I strive for is a user should never have to look up in the docs
Mhm,
unless they're doing something really like they're trying to, you know, subclass one of our APIs or like, do something
mhm.
where they're creating an interface to it for their own use case. But if they're doing applied use of our APIs, they shouldn't have to look at the docs. It should be
Yeah.
intuitive.
Yeah, there has to be like an elegance to it. I think that's the best. I mean, the things I aspire to are like just really well designed APIs, just ones that seem intuitive, like you say. And I think, I mean, that just it's like being a musician or something or an artist. Like you just gotta get like do it over and over again and fail and
Yep.
put out crap and have it reviewed and I think that's something that we see is I mean, I try to make like any new big feature area, I make sure that I can draw it out and visualize it first and then I can start breaking it down into tasks because if I can't get the big picture out, then I can't build it. And so, but then the API surface area is tough because yeah, there's usually somebody that kind of has it all in their head. But once your team grows and your API grows, how do you keep that consistency without review? Like you have to add that layer of review. Um, I mean, I don't know, maybe LLMs and code review and stuff like that will help in the future to like keep API surface areas cleaner and do reviews like that. It might be an interesting area,
Yeah, based on my testing so far, they're not quite
but
there yet.
yeah,
Like not even remotely close, but
yeah,
they're good for discrete things. Like,
yeah.
does
Well,
this API make sense?
yeah, you also sort of like hinted at answering the question, but didn't answer it. How do you, as an API and as a team grows, how do you preserve strong architecture? Because one person can't do all the reviews forever.
I mean, I think it's. I mean, documentation is important, but it can also be a burden. And so I think you've got to be careful with. I'm more of a visual documenter in terms of I like lucid chart. I like stuff like that that can kind of show people like how this stuff fits together, and that's more easily to train people on. The downside with written documentation is it can go out of date so quickly. And I think I've struggled with that balance of, I given we're more 0 to 1, it's like, I mean, we're more fast to lose for sure with documentation, but it's the knowledge base of Slack or the knowledge base of, I mean, just Google Docs or Lucid Chart is really where we focus. Um, we're not very prescriptive of like, okay, you have to have a design doc in this format and I mean, this much, this structure. I mean, we don't do that at all. Like, it's like, hey, at least I can get a diagram for something. We'll come up with a sort of like a list of features, like it's just no formality to it, but I'm like, we got to write it down in some way. And I think that's good because there's always going to be questions of like, wait, didn't you say this 3 months ago? And I don't know. Usually my memory is like, oh wait, I don't remember what we actually said because I've moved on to like five other things. I think just that knowledge capture becomes so important for the team. But there's so many ways to slice that. I mean, we end up just using, I mean, Slack or something like that a ton, but then having this kind of layered of okay, there's a doc to it, and there's probably a diagram to it as well.
Got it. And LLMs could help parsing and distilling
Yeah,
that knowledge repo, essentially.
for sure, for sure. And I think, I mean, just summarization, just good search. I mean, I think
Yeah,
is still a struggle for a lot of this kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah. Semantic search would be really helpful, at least in my life. Um, the amount of times I look up stuff in Slack and just have to permute the different combinations of words, it's ridiculous.
Well, and it's just the way they're doing it with, I mean, they're almost trying to be too helpful and finding you like, oh, well, this is the same thing, but with an extra letter at the end. I'm sure you want to see this too. Like, it's just like it becomes like it's not even useful at all in a lot of ways. So it, I think, yeah, I mean, it's not a solved problem, even though I think we have the tools now. I think like Glean and some of these kind of companies are now trying to really focus on like, okay, really good workplace search. But I think I mean, there's so many ways to approach that in other ways that I think there's going to be a lot more innovation there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Another question about software architecture. You hinted at the concept of layers. How
Yeah.
many layers should you have? And if there's not a single answer, how do you think about determining it?
Oh man. I mean, and this is maybe my leanings is I've always thought about separating the presentation layer from the sort of functional layer. And I know that's sort of a bit distinct from, I don't know, some of the full stack development and things like that. But I tend to always think of an API surface area and then building a team and a product to that API rather than thinking about them as all one thing, because that lets you productize the API later. And I mean, I know there's contrary opinion about that, but it's always worked for us where we've consumed our own API for our front end. And the main point of that is like we had companies where like, we don't really want to use your API. We just want to automate it through our system. And so I mean, that's actually worked really well that if you eat your own dog food and have a really good solid API that you build first to feed your presentation layer, your front end, then you can do a lot of stuff with it. I mean, you can write automation tools, you can write CLIs, you can do all this other stuff. So I tend to think in that classic layering of presentation, like to an API, and then there might be backend APIs that are all hidden behind the scenes. But really have that first API layer set like cleanly separated. And it also makes for developer experience. Like your first consumers of that are your own dev team. And so you're validating to your points before about how do you know if it's a consistent API and it's not, I mean, because your team is actually using it themselves. And I've done that time and time again where the internal team is your first customer of the API. And that helps shake out a ton of issues.
And sometimes, in my experience, uh, gives you the best feature requests.
Oh yeah.
So at Databricks, we're building stuff that people are going to be using. Like, I have a meeting on Monday with a team about a new feature that they'd like to use or have built to integrate with the product. And they they give me a quick 2-3 sentence explanation of what they're going to be building. I was like, I didn't even know that was a thing yet. Um, but that's super cool. Yeah, I'd love to chat about this. Like, when are you going to be releasing this? And they're like, oh, like December. We're shooting for, first private preview launch. Like, I just did a quick search on the internet and there's zero references for this, like what you're talking about being built. They're like, yeah, like nobody's done this yet. And we're very tight-lipped about it. Like, but MLflow doesn't support this thing
Mm,
that we need to do. So here's our list of requirements. Please review this before a meeting. So we're finding out 6 months, sometimes a year before
mhm.
any customer would even be aware of this thing. And we'll
Yep.
build these features in slowly, or sometimes quickly, in order to unblock that internal team. But we're not building stuff that's like, oh, this is in some private repo and nobody's ever going to see this.
Right.
We're releasing it. It's in open source. People can start playing around with it. And sometimes the fallback from that, or the fallout from that, is we'll get further feature requests from the community. They're like, this is cool, but can it also do this? And we're like, and then talk to the internal team. Like, do you guys need this? They're like, yeah, we were going to talk to you next week
There we
about
go.
that. I'm like, sweet. What do you think
That's cool.
about, what are your opinions on, what you guys are focusing on, something that is effectively a service layer, right?
Mhm.
And what are your thoughts about intelligent selective open sourcing of components versus keeping it all proprietary?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I've never actually released an open source project. I like product, like in a full sense. And we have done some small open sourcing of different components. So I'm not the best one to ask about it. I mean, we do leverage open source for, I mean, some things we do and support, I mean, and contribute back. But given it's a managed service, it's also hard for us where we're really focused on scale and, I mean, and the infrastructure side of it. It's like being another AWS or Azure service to us. It's an API that people can consume. They don't want to, I mean, there's going to be other companies that release maybe something like a RAG as a service that's fully open source, and you pull all the pieces together yourself. And we're kind of taking the other approach of like, you don't care what's running behind Stripe's infrastructure. It's just an API. And I think so. I don't have a ton of experience to pull from, but the way we're looking at open source is we open source the SDKs. So we're a
Mhm.
GraphQL API, but we just release native SDKs on top of that. Um, so if we screw something up, somebody can like fork it, fix it, and like build their own or whatever. Um, the other is UI layer, and so UI components that sit on our API, we're going to open source all of those. And so
Nice.
that's what we're looking at now, like kind of a chatbot in a box, or I mean an uploader tool, or different things like that. So those reusable components that just need our API key are going to be all open source. And so I think we want to, I mean, we're definitely supportive, but there's just no way we could open source our whole product, because you would still need like these other three managed services that, I mean, exist somewhere. And but on the other hand, I think the plugin model of, hey,
Right.
can you build a plugin to us that is just open source, is something we're looking at. Like we do support webhook kind of hooks in parts of the workflow, and we're looking at, can we just sort of have a little SDK that says, hey, I mean, maybe it simplifies the authentication, or it's something you can just fill in some code inside of. Um, that kind of stuff would all be open source too.
Cool. I have one final question slash topic. Um, where is the Graphlit value prop, and where
Mhm.
do you expect it to go in the next 2 to 5 years? Like, what industry trends are you betting the company on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the initial one is really kind of the conversion from DIY, we say, is there's been the last year was pull together LangChain, Llama Index, I mean, Pinecone, like all that. You basically have to pick all the different ingredients to make the recipe and then figure out how to deploy it, how to tune it, and all that kind of stuff. And so our first value prop is we're saving you developer time and we're saving you ongoing DevOps time too, as just, hey, it's just an API. And we're very cost effective. I mean, it's you're just paying like, I mean, to do what, I mean, even if you think of a couple $100 a month or 1,000 a month, I mean, that's still a tenth cheaper than a dev. I mean, and just to build it and maintain it. So that's our number one thing. And then we can have efficiency at scale. So, I mean, as new models come out, as we can get cheaper resources, I mean, we're going to pass that along to the customer. So it's really an efficiency, developer productivity and efficiency play at first. And then I think the long term is really, okay, now what can we do with that API that are higher level constructs like agent models or um, more integrated workflows with other products and things like that, and kind of the automation side of things. That's really what we're looking at. Is we've kind of released ingestion, retrieval, RAG with conversations, as well as what we call content publishing, which kind of uses RAG to generate new content. And then sort of automating that with some sort of agent framework on top of that is I see that's like kind of the next step. And I mean, we'll see where it goes from there.
Crystal clear. Yeah, it's interesting the emphasis on agents, where we have these sort of discrete steps that if you chain them together, they create something more powerful. It's like a complexity theory based design. It's super cool.
Well, and
Yeah.
it's interesting because that part's not new, and that's where I think people are looking at it as like, hey, this is really, and I mean, it's not LLM centric either. Like we've been doing actor model stuff for years, and I mean, and that's kind of I look at we're kind of taking a slow roll on that just because it's like see where that shakes out because I don't necessarily think you need an LLM specific agent model. You just need something like sort of an actor, like a durable actor model. And there's so many different things out there. Um, and you could build a lot of what I see these demos with, I don't know, we use like Azure Durable Functions or I don't know, akka, or I mean different things in different platforms. I don't see that like if you just have a good API for retrieval and RAG, you could probably build most of what everybody's doing. And so that's kind of the way we look at it is I don't know if we're going to build anything our own on that or if we'll just do integration examples on that. And so we're kind of taking a wait and see a little bit for the rest of the year to see what people are really looking for.
Yeah, it's exactly the feedback that we got many months ago when we got a couple of requests from customers who are like, yeah, LangChain has agents. We want to start using that. We're like, we of course when we hear that, we go and do a mini hackathon and play
Mm-hmm.
around, and I built a bunch of them. I'm like, yeah, this is cool, I guess, but I mean, I could just write a function that does this,
Right.
and
Yeah. Yeah.
like, then I don't have to do this in LangChain where there's you know some amount of stability questions about like the frequency of releases and breaking APIs. And I was like, do people really want this? So we talked to some of our customers that are heavily in the, hey, we're going to production with stuff. We start asking them, what's the stack that you're using? And we had one that was like, yeah, we write it like the whole backends in Scala using Akka framework.
Mm-hmm.
We actors are actors, doing this exact thing. So we can interface directly with the REST API to Chat GPT, and
Mm-hmm.
that's our interface layer for that. And then that then goes and farms out to all these other,
Yeah.
systems that we have. We don't need to use an open source package for that. We already have all of that. It's core language feature basically.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but when people start saying, like where they start interfacing with us, and I'm sure they're interfacing with your company as well, is they're like, yeah, we did the first project and built this all out. We have all this code. And it was so successful at our company. We now have 3 people from marketing, 2 people from sales, and 5 people from product that all want these projects built for these that require a completely
Hmm.
different code base. We don't have the staff. We can't hire 300 developers
Right.
to come in and build this. Databricks, can you help us out? So that, like, focusing on, okay, can we create a UI that
Yeah.
does this? And there's, companies such as yours that are focusing entirely on this problem. I really believe that that's the future of LLM usage.
Yeah.
It's, chat's useful, it's very useful, as a productivity tool, but for actual products that people are wanting to build, you need all of those interactions. You need a more
Yeah.
complex space, and individual companies are not going to have the resources available to build all these projects. You need a service.
Yeah. And I see, I mean, I always talk that like chat is just one consumption method. It's kind of the first one that ChatGPT kind of lit this bulb for everybody. And it's funny because we had been around for, I guess, almost 2 years building this unstructured data platform that used NLP and all this stuff. And then it was like the ChatGPT thing happened. And then people are like, oh, unstructured data. Like now we get what you've been saying for the last 2 years.
Yeah.
And it just, and probably for you guys too, it's like it just all this, it took a UI and a consumption method for it to click. And then literally this week there's an industry report all about unstructured data pipelines that looked like our pitch deck from 3 years ago. And it's something where all these pieces are fitting together that people are like, oh, now we can get access to this data. But not everybody doing this is going to be writing it in LangChain. I mean,
Right.
or even in Python for that matter. And so like we had somebody be like, how can I do this in Bubble? And I'm gonna like write I mean, and I'm like, cool, okay, you want just to use our 8 RAG API to build it in a Bubble app. Awesome. That's a great use case for us. And so that's really where we're heading is just make it something, it's a really clean, nice, easy to use API, good developer experience. Like we're adding like observability into our developer portal. And I mean, just copying what the best people do and who have great developer experience and being like taking those learnings and being like, okay, now we have an awesome logs page that we're building. And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but just give people what we know works in some of
Yep.
these areas. So, and then we innovate on the back end. Like, and
Exactly.
that's where we really focus. So
Why did you guys invest in unstructured pipelines pre ChatGPT?
So we were doing it as a cataloging, data cataloging. And so we were leaning into um, geospatial data tied to unstructured data. So like construction companies, ports, railways that had, I mean, they would say they have like 10 years of data collected. It's imagery, it's audio, it's documents. And so we were actually building them essentially a search interface, like for that had a visual view, it had a map view, and it had a time histogram to it. And that was the product we started the company building. And then the platform was just we were using it for ourselves. And it's funny because I mean that UI didn't get the fire that I expected it to because they were still trying to figure out SharePoint at a lot of these companies. And so it was, I mean, people it would demo great and they were like, oh, this is awesome. But then they're like, wait, how are we actually going to put this into practice when you have to sell it to our IT group and you have to do all that? And so we ended up just being like, wait, once we started having people like, wait, can we get access to the API, like the API that runs that? So we can integrate the capabilities of it into our own products. We got a couple of those and we started thinking, wow, maybe that's actually the path. And then the ChatGPT thing happened. And I was like, oh, wow, we're long-term memory for these models.
Mm-hmm.
Like we've already built the funnel. And that's when we pivoted to just be the platform first about 18 months ago. So,
Super cool.
and I would love to come back around and take our original app that we built and release it maybe as an open source app on top of our API. I mean, if I'd love to, I mean, at some point be able to do that. We might do that as like our, because I don't want to compete with the people that are building apps on us, but maybe that's just a great full featured example of what you could do on us. And so that I think it'll all circle back around.
I have a use case for that I would implement right this second, like as soon as the
Yeah.
podcast ends.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, we're coming up
Awesome.
on time. I will quickly summarize some interesting points that I heard. Uh, First, queues and event-driven architectures are great for scaling. Um, when to hire versus when to learn? Well, there are a few axes. One is project duration. Another is project importance or sort of centrality to the infrastructure. And third is employee supply in the market. If people are really expensive, you might want to just spend the weekend learning it. And then a few miscellaneous tips. Thinking about architecture and sort of visually drawing out components is really helpful when designing scalable systems that will be scalable into the future. Creating internal knowledge repos like Slack. Don't document everything because it can quickly become out of date. And then when you're developing public APIs, it's important to have that public stable API and then at least one private layer where stuff happens. You can have 1, 7, a million. It doesn't really matter. But having a stable public facing API is super important. And then eat your own dog food. So, Kirk, if people want to learn more about you or your work, where should they go?
Yeah, definitely Graphlit. Graphlit.com is the company, and then we're on Twitter. I'm on Twitter just at Kirk Marple. LinkedIn's good, and yeah, just I mean, we're for anybody who wants to play around with it. We're free to sign up, free to use, up to a good healthy amount of data that you want to try out, and so happy to have people give it a try.
Cool. All right. Well, until next time, it's been Michael Burke and my co host.
Ben Wilson.
And have a good day, everyone.
We'll catch you next time.